Welcome to Band Musicianship Lesson 9, Dotted Notes, Eighth Notes, and Subdivision. Here we see a half note. We know that a half note is worth 2 beats. If we add a dot to this note, now this note is worth 3 beats. Young musicians often confuse that a dot equals 1 beat. That is not always true. A dot means that we take half of the value of the note that precedes it and add it to that note. Let's look at a couple examples of this. Here we have a dotted whole note. Now we know that a whole note normally equals 4 beats. So if we take the dot, that means we're going to use half of the value of that. Half of the value of 4 beats is 2 beats. Then we add these two together. That means that a dotted whole note is worth 6 beats total. Let's try this now with another example. Let's come back to our dotted half note. We know that a half note is worth 2 beats. And we know the dot means we add half the value of that. Half the value of 2 beats equals 1 beat. So we add 2 plus 1, and then we come up with the answer 3. For each dotted note value in music, there is an equivalent dotted rest value as well. In this case, the dotted half note, which is equal to 3 beats, has an equivalent which is the dotted half rest, which is worth 3 beats of silence. A tie is a curved line. It connects 2 or more notes of the same pitch. It combines the value of these notes together, like simple math. If we take a half note and we add this tie to a quarter note, that means it's 2 beats plus 1 beat. The half note is worth 2, while the quarter note is equal to 1. This would equal the same thing as a dotted half note, which we now know is worth 3 beats. If we now take that half note and we tie it to another half note, each is worth 2 beats. It's 2 plus 2. It would equal the same thing as a whole note. Now if we look at 2 quarter notes, each quarter note is worth a beat each. It's 1 plus 1. It equals 2, which is the same as a half note. Let's take a look at what some of these ties will look like on the staff. Here we have 2 half notes tied together, which equals 4 beats. When the stems point up, the ties are drawn below the notes on the staff. Here we see the stems are pointed upward. Therefore, the tie has to be below those notes. When the stems of notes point downward, ties are drawn above the notes. We see that these stems point down, so the tie is drawn over the notes as opposed to underneath the notes. Ties are very useful when the duration of a note is longer than what the time signature will allow within a measure. Let's look at an example of this. If we're in 3/4 time, we can only have 3 beats in a measure. So if we add a dotted half note, we know that would take up the whole measure because it's worth 3 beats. But let's say we wanted that note to be 4 beats long. Well, we can't write that in 3/4 time within a measure. So we have to use a tie to be able to do that. So we would use a tie over the bar line, connecting it into the next measure. Now we see it's 3 plus 1, that equals 4 beats now. If we complete that measure, we could complete it with a half note. Let's say we wanted that note to be longer. Well, we could make it 3 beats long. All we'd have to do is add a tie and add a quarter note over that bar line, and now that note is 3 beats long. and we can use these ties over bar lines so that we can still hold long notes out within a shorter time signature. Now we're going to talk about a very important word called subdivision. Subdivision breaks or divides notes down into smaller equal parts. So if we take a whole note that we know is worth 4 beats, we can cut it in half and subdivide it into 2 equal parts. So a whole note would be equal to 2 half notes tied together. That's a subdivision. We could subdivide it even more and break it into 4 parts, and then it would be equal to 4 quarter notes that would all be tied together. This time we're subdividing it by 4. Let's look at a different type of note now. If we use a half note, we can subdivide a half note into 2 equal parts. It would be equal to 2 quarter notes that are tied together. We have subdivided this note into 2 parts. Now let's come back to our dotted half note that we learned about. When we see dotted rhythms, we should subdivide them into 3 parts. So instead of dividing this in half, we're going to divide it into 3 equal parts, which would be 3 quarter notes tied together. Now let's discuss a newer rhythm note that we're going to call an eighth note. An eighth note is worth half a beat or a count. Eighth notes are made up of 3 different parts. We have the note heads that look like note heads on a quarter note. We have the stems that look like stems on a quarter note. But we have an extra part on an eighth note that we call a flag. The flag hangs off to the side, always on the right side of an eighth note. The eighth notes that we just talked about that use flags are normally only used for a single eighth note, when we see an eighth note by itself. When we see a bunch of eighth notes in a row, they're normally beamed together. Here we have 2 eighth notes, and they have a beam on top that connects the 2 stems together. Here are 3 eighth notes beamed together, and here are 4 eighth notes beamed together. Eighth notes can even be beamed in larger groupings than 4. For each eighth note value in music, there's an equivalent eighth rest value as well. Here we have our eighth note with the flag off to the side. Here's what an eighth rest looks like. Also worth half a beat of silence. Now compare the eighth rest to a quarter rest. Make sure you don't mix these 2 symbols up, because in fact, the quarter rest is equal to 2 eighth rests, being that each eighth rest is half a beat of silence. When you add them together, it equals 1 beat of silence. Now that we know what an eighth note is, now we can subdivide notes using eighth notes. This breaks it down even further. We can take a quarter note and subdivide it into 2 equal parts, which would equal 2 eighth notes tied together, because each eighth note is worth half a beat. If we take a half note, we can subdivide this more than quarter notes. We can divide it into 4. So that would equal 4 eighth notes, each one equaling half a beat, adding together equals 2. If we take a dotted half note, which equals 3 beats, we can subdivide that into 6 eighth notes. Adding them all together equals 3 beats in total. Now if we take a whole note, which equals 4 beats, we can subdivide that into 8 eighth notes, each equaling half a beat each. Now we're going to look at another new rhythm. This is called a dotted quarter note. A dotted quarter note has a value of 3 eighth notes, or 1.5 beats. Remember what the dot means. We have a quarter note that's worth 1 beat, and the dot is worth half of the value of that, which is half a beat. When we add these together, it equals 1.5 beats total. Remember, we can also subdivide this by 3 because it's a dotted note, so it would equal 3/8 notes tied together. A half a beat each added together equals 1.5 beats. Now we've learned what a dotted quarter note means. Now we know that there can be an equivalent rest, which is a dotted quarter rest. This would also be equal to 3/8 rests stacked together. Please make sure you have completed the dotted notes, eighth notes, and subdivision worksheet and student assignment.